Salam, it's Yasmin. This season on Me and My Muslim Friends, we are featuring conversations with changemakers. Today's guest is someone I've been so eager to have on the podcast for literally years. Her name is Sameera Qureshi, and she is a therapist and founder of Sexual Health for Muslims. Her approach to sex education, therapy, and health is grounded in the Islamic framework and the Islamic understanding of the soul. Unfortunately, most Muslims don't have access to a comprehensive sex education growing up. We'll dive into the consequences of that, and we'll talk about some of the most common issues Sameera hears in her counseling practice. You'll notice I don't have a co-host with me for today's episode. It turns out a lot of people are uncomfortable talking about this topic, but I'm happy to carry the torch by myself. It's my hope the knowledge she brings makes this one of the most meaningful episodes we've ever done. I think they explained to you that normally I have a co-host.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I had a very hard time finding someone who would be comfortable joining me and probably sheds light on the importance of why we're doing this.
Yeah.
For sure. But I will say every single person I talked to said they wanted to listen to it.
That's interesting, but no one wants to be associated with it, which is deeply problematic. I'm glad we're doing this.
So I'm just curious if you could tell us about your background. How long have you been a practicing therapist, and how does someone become a sexual health therapist?
Yeah, I had a bit of an unconventional journey in beginning. My background is occupational therapy, and I started working around 16 years ago in Canada. I was assigned to actually a mental health project that serviced Islamic private religious schools. And a year into that program, we started noticing issues with middle school kids and topics related to puberty and gender and online social media stuff. And so the schools were obviously not teaching the sexual health curriculum. And so I remember thinking, why don't we just create a version that is more aligned with our Islamic faith tradition and values? And so I collaborated with the Islamic studies staff at the school, and also had a mentor who was a sex educator for over 20 years and who taught me how to develop curriculum and programs. And it really developed from there, from around 2010 onwards. And so I didn't intentionally seek the role of sexual health educator or now therapist in the space. And so I never had any formal schooling around this. It's all been a lot of my own professional development after I started back then. And I've continued to see the gaps, and I've continued to see a need. And I think my own journey with Islam and sexual health has definitely evolved over these 16 years, for sure.
I actually want to go into the gap issue. So my mom always opted me into sex ed. And it wasn't until college that I learned that not all Muslim parents did that. Years ago, when I asked her about it, she said she was just relieved someone else could teach me about it in school. Your website points out that many Muslim parents opt their kids out of sex ed in schools, masjids don't fill in those gaps, and many Muslims end up learning about sex from inaccurate sources. Can you give insight on why you think sex ed has been missing, and what are some of the key consequences for Muslim youth not having a comprehensive sex education?
I think the reasons why there's gaps are multiple. The first one is, as we both know, there's so much shame and taboo around this topic of sex and sexual health. And unfortunately, it's not coming from our Islamic tradition. It's coming from other sources, such as colonization of Islam, very literal puritanical perspectives of the Islamic tradition. And I think also a reduction of sexual health down to the topic of sex, which, of course, when Muslims hear that word, they think, well, I'm not married or my kids aren't married, so it's too early, and it's going to only corrupt them if they learn about this when it's too early. So I think from within the Muslim community space, there are those gaps. And then when you look at mainstream, let's say schools and society, there's been a bit of a separation between religion, spirituality, and sexuality. And so there's a gap in terms of how do we create sexual health curriculum that doesn't just have elements of Islam sprinkled into it, but really starts from the Islamic tradition and evolves from there. So I think the gaps are twofold from within the community and then from the outside. And I think with parents are doing the absolute best they know what to do. And I think there's a lot of lack of resources, lack of support. And I think the tendency is for Muslim parents to want to shelter and protect and to say, well, if this is not being taught from an Islamic framework, well, then why should I expose it to my kids?
And what are the consequences that you've seen when kids are not getting this sort of comprehensive spiritual, even education, if any at all?
So there's quite a few, but we can frame it under the umbrella of Muslims are feeling disconnected from their sexual health. And it's seen as this abstract thing that they're not meant to touch or go near until they're married, which is seen as, the permissible time to start learning about sexual health when it's still reduced down to sex, right? Because that's what sexual health is often seen as. So the consequence is this disconnection from something that God naturally created and gave all of us. And so with this disconnection, there comes other consequences such as shame. So this feeling of unworthiness or kind of disgust or very low self-worth with regards to one's body. There can also be a lack of foundational information about one's body. So a lot of Muslims that I work with don't understand what is healthy sexual health, and then when do I need to seek professional support and resources. Without a baseline, how do we navigate when issues may come up? And so what I see is often, clients, Muslim clients who are in their 20s, 30s, 40s onward. And then when we talk about their history, it often stems to lack of comprehensive sexual health education, a lack of holistic understanding of the Islamic tradition. And so we often see issues downstream that often are reflective of this disconnection and also a lack of baseline information.
Oh, I have so many thoughts. But I hope we get into some of what is healthy sexual health in this conversation. I do want to start more with some of the spiritual foundation because one of the things that drew me to your work is that you tie in an Islamic understanding of the soul into your framework for sexual health. You say that sex ed for Muslims must be framed in a conversation about the soul. Why do you think this was missing in previous teachings, and why is it so important?
So I think if we look at Islam in modern times, that being over the last 150 to 200 years, we see that a lot of Islamic civilizations have been colonized by European sources. And so one of the results of that is that Muslims pushed back. And I think one in trying to preserve Islamic teachings and the way of life, turned to very puritanical, literal interpretations of Islam that were all about the halal and the haram. So what is permissible and what is religiously impermissible. And so those schools of thought have made their way to the West, to the United States, to North America. And what I see is a lot of reductionistic understandings of a very holistic Islamic tradition. So in that puritanical, literal perspectives that has come to the West, we see there is really no talk about the soul, even though it's been within the Islamic tradition since its inception. And so there has been a recent revival of Islamic psychology or a study of the soul, a science of the soul, because that is what Islam is. There are so many Quranic verses and hadith that talk about the journey of our soul and how we're meant to spiritually develop in the time that we have in this life, and that we existed before we were born and we will exist after we pass on. And so it's unfortunate that the soul has been gutted out, not just from sexual health in Islam, that relationship, but from a lot of different relationships that intersect with religion. So I think what that has done is that it has made Muslims really forget what our tradition is. And so we don't often see this intersection being made until recent times.
And can we talk about the levels of the soul. I've seen you discuss this on your Instagram page sometimes, and I find it so fascinating that Islamically we have kind of these understandings of levels of the soul, and I wanted to help people understand that as well.
Yeah, so there are a few models of the soul, and the Quran highlights, I think, the most commonly understood one because it's a bit more simplistic. So the Quran highlights three levels of the soul, and they're not meant to be linear. So it's not like you're moving up a ladder. They're quite fluid and dynamic. And the purpose of us learning about that is to really understand when we are showing up in certain ways in the world to ask ourselves, where could my soul be at this time? The base level is called the nafs al amara, or the soul that commands to harm. And there are two main functions of this level of the soul, one of which is sexual desire or lust, or in Arabic, shahwa, and the second is anger or ghadab. And this level of the soul, we can think of it of self-preservation. So anger is helping us preserve ourselves as individuals, and then the sexual desire. And the lust is meant for sexual pleasure within marriage and then also for reproductive purposes. So we can imagine that this level of the soul, when it becomes imbalanced, or let's say there are temptations that pull out this level of the soul, a Muslim may struggle with too much sexual desire, even too much anger, right, with this level of the soul. And so it may pull them towards behaviors that are taking them away from being spiritually aligned with God and Allah. And then if we go into the next level of the soul, it's called the nafs al-lawama, or what's called the self-discerning soul. And this is the soul that starts to get a little bit more insight about what's showing up in terms of our behaviors and our thoughts. So for example, a Muslim person here may start to think, I have this value of abstinence, but I'm realizing it's really tough for me to follow through on it when I'm out there meeting people and trying to get married, or I'm noticing a temptation to kind of act on my sexual desire. I wonder what that's about. And I wonder if I can gain a bit more awareness about why it's kind of showing up and what I can change about what I'm doing, for example. So this is meant to be introspection and self-awareness. And this is the second stage of the soul journey that we're chatting about. And then the third stage is something that I think Muslims really strive to get to, and it's really tough. It's called the nafs al-mutma'inna, or the soul at peace. And we can think that the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, is the role model for this level of the soul. So it's when we are completely satisfied and in harmony in presence of God. So it's where we've conquered our lower self, not to a point of obliterating it. We don't want to do that. We can't do that. God gave us these levels of the soul for a reason, but we're not being pulled into those lower levels where it takes us away from our journey towards our spiritual potential. And so a Muslim during their lifetime is going to fluctuate in a day within these levels of the soul, within a week, month, years. And so it's not a static model, but it's really meant to have us be introspective about how we're showing up in the world around us.
Another thing that I wanted to go into a little bit more is that your approach to sexual health is based in the Islamic tradition and our worldview as Muslims. In addition to the soul, can you explain some of the foundations of this worldview for anyone who might be unfamiliar?
What it comes down to is the term Muslim actually means submission. So it's a person who submits to the teachings of Islam and to the Quran and Revelation. So a Muslim is someone who submits to the spiritual journey. And so our worldview as a Muslim, it's not just about these religious practices that Muslims are often associated with. So it's not just fasting during Ramadan, 1 month of the year. It's not just about our daily prayers. Those are really, really critical. And we also have to remember that the submission includes everything. And so I give the metaphor of, you can imagine Muslims are wearing a pair of glasses, and everything that they're living and seeing and understanding and interpreting is trying to be through this lens of submission, of, this relationship with God, of trying to become closer to God. And so it's not just about the practices that reinforces the worldview that we have, but it really is about this God consciousness pair of glasses that Muslims are really trying to wear and keep on, despite everything around us that may be pulling us in different directions.
You touched on this a bit earlier, but I'd love to know, what are some of the most common issues you find raised in your practice?
Yeah, there's a few depending on the life stage that Muslims are showing up with. I will say that shame is a big one that shows up across different issues. So, for example, a Muslim who has experienced sexual or other forms of trauma, there's a deep sense of disconnection from their bodies, from their sexual health, and also from Islam, especially if Islam was misused against them in how they experience their trauma. So, shame, I would say, is quite pervasive. I'll also say that there's a real struggle with Muslims who are trying to hold on to their God conscious glasses, and then they're trying to navigate life. So, Muslims who are engaging in premarital sex or pornography use or masturbation, even, and they don't want to. There's a cognitive sense of, I know what my values are. And then there's the real world struggle of, I'm struggling with keeping these glasses on and knowing how to do that, right? Because knowing what's right or wrong is not enough. There's a struggle, and that struggle is internal oftentimes. And then I also see within the context of marriage a lot of issues around sexual intimacy, difficulty with communicating about sexual intimacy, all the way to having pleasurable sexual intimacy in marriage, and on and on. I think when we think about, the large life stages, there are really common issues that I'll also say are not just limited to the Muslim community. They're in mainstream and other religious spaces too. And so it's definitely, we're seeing the same things that other folks experience. I think we definitely have more complications as Muslims to navigate through.
I also appreciate your work breaking down myths. I'm sure you see these also come across in your discussions. What are common misconceptions you hear about what you do specifically, and what are some common myths you are working against in your work?
Where do I start with this? I
Oh gosh.
It's really tough to pinpoint this down because I feel like it's a constant battle. I think one of the biggest myths I face is, why are you talking about this? And I think especially in terms of how I show up in a space. So, I don't wear a hijab, a headscarf. I think people are maybe not used to seeing a Muslim woman speak so openly and confidently about Islamic tradition, citing Islamic tradition, citing scholars, studying it, and then talking about sexual health in a way that I'm not reducing or beating around the bush. The topic, I'm actually speaking about it quite openly and practically. I don't think Muslims are used to that. And I've had Muslims access my content and they cut off my name. Like, they'll share my posts, but they'll cut off my name. They won't follow me, but then they'll share stuff now and then. So it's this shame piece that's coming in again. I think that's the biggest myth I find is, why are you talking about this? And the shame piece around people accessing the content.
Can we kind of talk about, I guess, more concrete examples of these myths and how they show up?
I'll say that a lot of Muslims hold the myth that virginity is a Islamic concept and that it relates to certain things like menstrual products. So that tampons and menstrual cups and discs are impermissible because there's an idea that that's going to break or snap the hymen, and that is what determines a woman's sexual status. And we know that that's completely not Islamic. We know that the hymen will naturally stretch and even, stretch. Sorry, I'm just going to pause.
Absolutely, yeah.
I get a little frustrated about this myth keep coming up, to be honest, because I'm like, it's 2024 and are we really still here? Like, we don't have sex with tampons. Can you put that in the podcast?
Yes, we can. Yes,
Okay.
we can. Oh, man.
Okay. So I've come across the tampon myth over the 16 years that I've been in this field, and it continues to both frustrate and shock me. I think the frustrating part is the lack of nuanced thought and intention around this topic. So, number one, menstruation is a God given process, and there are many different menstrual hygiene products that we have access to. And so, products such as tampons and menstrual cups are not to have sex with, they are used for menstrual hygiene. And so, this idea that tampon or menstrual cup use is impermissible before marriage because it affects a woman's virginity is absolutely un Islamic and honestly ridiculous. So, I would encourage Muslims to really think about separating our body out from just being seen as a sexual object. And I think that's the part that many Muslims aren't understanding is our reproductive system is not just sexual in nature. So a teenager, a young woman, a woman who uses a menstrual product and they're not married, they're using it for the purpose of menstruation. They are not using it for sexual intercourse. So being able to see our bodies in nuanced perspectives and remember our intentions as Muslims for why we're taking care of our bodies, including our menstrual cycles, is so, so important because that's what's missing is the nuanced intentionality.
I feel like even for me, when you think about sex ed, a lot of people think it's about, and I grew up in North Carolina, so it was mostly an abstinence framed education that I had. But I mean, my first one I think was in fifth grade, and it was really only focused on what is a period. And you might have this in the next few years, and just kind of understanding the biology of yourself. It wasn't about sex. It was about, a biological understanding of what is about to happen to your body. And I can't really imagine not having had that education or explanation, or do you know what I mean? So thank you for that. You also mentioned in one of your responses earlier the judgment that sometimes you feel that you get, as a therapist speaking more bluntly or directly about these things. And one of the things that I appreciate about your account, Sexual Health for Muslims, is that you kind of use the social media space to discuss other issues. One of your social posts is about Muslims lacking compassion toward one another, and another post is about judgment. I'd really like your perspective on this judgment/policing of bodies that we often see on social media. It's not particularly tied to sexual health per se, but it is something that women, I think, can relate to on social media, whether it's comments on what they're wearing, comments on activities they're involved in, just basically harassment online in this kind of culture of it's okay to police people. And I don't know, I think they think that they have the right intentions in what they're doing, but I think they can be extremely hurtful. And I think you've talked about this on your own account, so I'd love to hear your perspective.
Yeah, the reason I bring up this judgment of Muslims and the lack of compassion is I think it relates back to what we're often projecting on others that is actually coming from ourselves. So there's this moral, idealistic nature that a lot of Muslims walk around with, where, and I'm sure we're all guilty of this, where we are trying to feel better about ourselves as Muslims, or we misuse the Islamic teaching of, enjoying good and forbid evil, which Muslims take to the extreme of any Muslim I see who is not fitting my image of what a proper good Muslim should be, I'm going to call them out, which is completely un-Islamic. So I think there's this idea of moral policing, as you said, and feeling better about oneself as a Muslim. And we tend to box Muslim into a particular visual stereotype. And the reason I post about this, even though it doesn't seem directly sexual health related, is because as Muslims, we're so focused on other Muslims and we are lacking focus on ourselves. So each of us has this journey to try and better ourselves and to work on our soul, including our sexual health, because it's tied to our spirituality. Yet we're so focused on telling other Muslims what their issues are based on our own preconceived notions or our own traumas and our own challenges that we're projecting. So I keep seeing this trend of lack of compassion. I mean, I'm sure you have, and I've experienced it myself. And I'm just really trying to get Muslims to turn inwards, because if we don't, I really don't see anything or much changing in our communities, to be honest.
In addition to individual and couples counseling, you offer parent counseling. What is some of your advice for Muslim parents on talking to their kids about sex, and at what age do you recommend that start?
So, speaking of Islam and focusing on yourself, I really recommend parents educating themselves, which I think is a process of asking themselves, what did I learn or not learn about sexual health in Islam? What do I need to unlearn? What is my comfort level with this topic? Who are my resources? I think it's really important that parents start with themselves. And I would say that I often get the question about what age, and I will say that it is a process that begins from a very young age, and it's nothing to do with sex. So we know that, when kids are learning about hygiene and toilet training, and they eventually learn about, changing their clothes behind closed doors and, wudu and religious practices, we need to teach them about their bodies. I mean, how are we teaching them how to clean themselves after using the bathroom, and we're not teaching them the names of their body parts? It really is about safety and about comfort with their body, and about only talking about their body with trusted adults. So it really is important, I would say, before kids enter any sort of school setting, to understand their bodies for safety and biological functional reasons. And then as we develop physically and mentally and spiritually, for example, preteen, prepubescent, then we need to amplify the knowledge that we're sharing with our kids. And that is not just about the do's and don'ts, but it's really about getting ahead of their development, because puberty marks the age of spiritual accountability. When kids start puberty, menstrual cycle, or the first nocturnal emission, that is when we become directly accountable to God for our actions. And so if we're not equipping teens with that information, then we're not setting them up for success. So it really is a journey. It's a series of conversations over a child's lifetime, and it's equipping adults with what they need to know as they continue to develop through their life stages.
So, for people who may want to see you, whether it's a parent or a couple or an individual, it's hard enough to find a therapist with availability these days, let alone one with your Islamic framework. And so many will have to go with non Muslim options for therapy related to sexual health. In your professional opinion, how can non Muslim practitioners help to bridge the gap and reach Muslim patients?
Such an important question. I would say that number one, non-Muslim professionals need to take time to really decolonize their understandings of Islam. It's a common thing that I've noticed when I'm training professionals is their Islam 101 knowledge is really lacking. It's been learned from inaccurate, non-holistic sources. So I would say starting there, and then building upon knowledge of sexual health, mental health, and other aspects of health. I think it really does start with a foundation in Islam that is accurate and holistic. And then I think I've had non-Muslim professionals reach out and to other even Muslim counselors for consultations. I've had folks access my social media and say, this has really helped me with my Muslim clients or patients. And I'm like, wow, that's awesome. It's almost indirect learning. It's not intentional training they're going to. But I think being able to reach out to Muslim professionals in this space, whether it's directly or indirectly, and being able to learn and consult and support Muslims doing this work, I think those are really important steps. And having the humility to do that is really, really important. It's something that I've definitely had to learn, and it's something that I think all professionals would benefit from.
I want to touch on something that I really wanted to dive into earlier in this conversation. You mentioned that a consequence of not having sex ed is just a complete lack of understanding of sexual health and what that would look like when it's healthy. So, what does sexual health that is healthy mean? What does that look like?
For a Muslim who has an Islamic worldview of their, God conscious glasses on, that would be understanding and embracing sexual health knowledge for the sake of taking care of their body that Allah has gifted them with. So it's this sense of deep responsibility of sexual health is something that God has given and created in us. It is not something separate from who we are. And for a Muslim to really see and take that seriously, because their intention is to please God through taking care of their body. So that means being proactive and not reactive. Muslims love to be reactive. We love to wait until something is wrong, and then we want to seek help, and then we're backtracking. So Islam really is a religion and framework of prevention and being proactive. And so being able to see our sexual health in that light, that would, to me, that seems like healthy sexual health for a Muslim.
And what can our Muslim listeners do to improve their sexual health knowledge? What advice do you have for them?
I think my work always boils down to self-reflection because I think we often lack that. And, society is just about externalizing. So I think I would want to tell Muslims, like, take a deep breath and ask yourself, what do I know about sexual health? What does sexual health even mean to me? Where did I first learn about the topic of sexual health? Who taught me? What's missing? And also, how does it even feel in my body when I hear sexual health and Islam spoken in the same sentence? I think these are all really important reflection questions where if we're starting from where we're at, then we can start to think about, well, what do I need from that point? And it's always from a place of compassion. So, we're not talking about being harsh on ourselves and, asking, why am I missing this, and being angry with oneself or with our situation, but from a place of, what, I'm learning and I always will be learning. And so let me be compassionate and also add sexual health to my journey as a Muslim.
Thank you so much, Sameera. I think we talked a lot about frustrations in this episode. And so I wanted to give an opportunity to maybe talk about what you find most rewarding about your work.
I think what's been rewarding has been that my work is, alhamdulillah, thanks to God, been a reflection of my own personal journey as a Muslim. And so I see myself as the main focus of, quote, my work, because it informs how I show up. And I think that's been rewarding. As much of a struggle as it's been, I think it's been rewarding to look back and kind of see the blessings of where my personal and professional journey have often been intertwined. And so I hope that continues, because it means that I'm walking the talk, and that's really important to me. I think I have to walk the talk as a Muslim in this space.
Sameera, this was such an important conversation. I've been wanting to have you on the show for so long, and I really can't wait for people to listen to this. When I was driving to the studio today, I genuinely felt like I was doing something important. And so I hope that you feel the same way, and I hope this reaches people and helps them in however way it can, and maybe provides just an introduction to this if they've never had the opportunity to get it before. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for being willing to talk to me about it, and for all the wisdom that you shared. I really appreciate it.
It was such an honor to be chatting with you, Yasmin, and I really, really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you so much.
I want to shout out the incredible production team behind this show, including editor Jared Walker, producer Liz Schlemmer, and executive producer Wilson Sayre. Thanks also to Al Wadarski, Sean Rue, and Denarius Thomas, who engineer our recordings and help master the podcast. Art is by Mohammed Asalti, and original music is written and recorded by Grant Livesey. Thanks for listening. It would be amazing if you subscribed and left a review for this show, or checked us out on Instagram at Me and My Muslim Friends. I'm Yasmin Bendaas. Whether or not you have a Muslim friend, you'll find one here. Me and My Muslim Friends is made possible through a partnership with WUNC North Carolina Public Radio. Find more on-demand content and ways to support this podcast at WUNC.org.